Reading for Wildlife. Written and illustrated by Zella, a project by Zella and Friends. An elephant for breakfast.
Chapter 22. Who is the Blackbird? Over the next days, Uncle Cosmo looked pale and withdrawn. He showered and tidied himself up. He ate some proper home-cooked food. He had even been to the doctor, but he had never felt nor looked more wretched. The children rallied around, trying to distract him. They thought up useful projects he could help with. He climbed the highest tree in the garden for them and fixed a strong new rope. It was knotted with a special bowline on the bight and a couple of half hitches. He felt confident it would hold. Attached to the other end was an old tractor tyre. It made for a great swing. 3 of them could sit comfortably and 5 at a pinch. They could get such momentum that it made Bella's stomach flip and Rose squeal with delight. It was even better than the old swing that he'd made several years ago. Bigger and stronger. The old swing now looked as if it was for little children, thought Bella. Even though Uncle Cosmo was helpful and involved, he often looked sad. Rose knew that he was thinking of Josephine. He seemed utterly heartbroken. Uncle Cosmo could not even contemplate that she could be capable of cruelty to elephants. He knew that a family of elephants had died just for the ivory in that one tea chest alone. Uncle Cosmo thought of the gracious ebony elephants marching across his grandmother's mantelpiece, each one different and carved from a real-life model. They were such majestic creatures. On his adventures, a family of elephants was one of his favourite things to see. Rose overheard her parents and Uncle Cosmo speaking about it. She heard her father, Rupert, saying, "Cosmo, people change. How well do you really know Josephine? Perhaps she changed and you didn't realise." "Now, where have I heard that before?" interrupted Mother, looking rather critically at Father as she brought them both a cup of tea. Rose called a meeting at the end of the garden. Johnny, Bella, Tom, Freddie and Lucky perched on a little stone circle they had collected especially for their deliberations. "It's not right," Rose began. "Josephine can't have been up to no good with those 2 awful policemen. I just know she's not capable of killing or having elephants killed. So what do we actually know? I heard the shock in her voice when she caught those ruffians with the ivory." Tom took a stick and on the ground he wrote, "Beware the Blackbird." Then he drew a circle and inside wrote an S for secretary. Bella took up his cue. "We know that there were several warnings about someone called the Blackbird." "Father said he had been warned by Uncle Cosmo's secretary," said Tom, as he drew a line between the warning and the S for secretary. Rose drew another line between the S for secretary and the warning. She added, "Then there was a message on the window pane written in the dust. It also warned of the Blackbird." Even though that was written by Uncle Cosmo, and we know that he was talking to his secretary at the time, Johnny said, as he joined the 2 lines between the S and the warning, "This is just the secretary repeating her evidence." We know that Josephine voluntarily told me about her grandmother's bracelet. I would never have known if it was a bird if she hadn't have told me, said Rose. She drew a separate circle with a J in it for Josephine, but she did not connect it to the warning. No. That story by itself does not connect Josephine with the warning, said Rose. All we know is that Josephine could stop those two in their tracks by calling them by their full names, observed Tom. But that could be because she's known them since they were small and she obviously knew their families, said Bella. I don't think anything I saw or heard connects her to the warning about the Blackbird, said Johnny. And didn't she voluntarily tell us about the Blackbird clue written in the dust? Would she really have done that if she was the Blackbird? Tom reflected on this. Maybe not. Those crooks also suggested Josephine knew the Blackbird. If that's right, then she can't actually be the Blackbird. But do we know of anything other than the bracelet that points to Josephine? No, said Freddie. Bella said, why don't we go and ask Uncle Cosmo about the warning he received and about his secretary? I think that we need to know if there's anyone else who has a connection with the factory and a Blackbird. If anyone knows, then he does. Good idea, Bella, said Freddie. I'm in, said Tom. I was never quite convinced it was Josephine. She seems too nice. He smiled at Rose. She is kind and thoughtful, I could just tell. Did you know that after she rang the police, she also thought to ring for an ambulance? Those two men in the shed might have died if she hadn't done that, said Rose. Aunt Alicia told me that it probably saved their lives, said Bella. George Grimble and Patrick Plum deserved to go to prison. It was so wicked to beat those two policemen and then tie them up, and all just for their uniforms. I hope they're thrown into prison for a long time, said Tom. They found Uncle Cosmo sitting at the writing desk. His diary was open, with his pen resting on the page, and he was gazing out of the window. Uncle Cosmo, said Johnny directly, do you know of any other connection between your factory and a Blackbird? That's a good question, said Uncle Cosmo seriously as he turned to look at the children. I've been thinking of little else. I know every single worker, but none by the name of Blackbird. Think hard, Uncle Cosmo, said Rose. It doesn't have to be a person. There could be some other connection with a Blackbird. Perhaps someone kept one as a pet, suggested Bella. No, not that I recall, said Uncle Cosmo, but you have just given me an idea. My secretary, Doris, does have a very wealthy uncle, Sir Reginald Ashurst. He travels in style with no expense spared. He happily spends money on himself without a thought for the poor in Africa. I don't like him. He is much too selfish. Now, several years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, people whispered that he owned a spy plane called a Blackbird, but I never saw it. I thought it was just a rumour. There were only a handful of Blackbird spy planes built, and a number of those were supposed to have been lost in accidents. They were never available commercially, but were a stealth plane used by the military. It would be an impossible plane to own. You know, it doesn't even have a door. You'd need to employ a mechanic to bolt you inside. No, I find that very unlikely. But her uncle was a very remote figure, and no one would ever have been close enough to him to find out. He gazed out of the window and appeared to be concentrating intently on something in the sky. Even his niece? Said Tom quietly, but Uncle Cosmo seemed lost in thought and did not appear to have heard Tom. When Uncle Cosmo turned his attention back to the children, he said, I need to think. Perhaps I'll call Doris. He then ambled down the garden to lie in the tyre swing and think about it.
With enormous thanks to Amanny Mo. Here is how you can help. Share the story. Adopt an animal. Visit when you can. Educate yourself. Donate to a conservation charity. To find out more about Reading for Wildlife, visit zellahunter.com or at Lady Zella Books, or follow the Reading for Wildlife YouTube channel.